So the country is seeing this massive rise in mass shootings as of late, and now the issue of gun reform and gun control is now being brought up to the spotlight once again. What do you see as a potential solution for America's gun problem?
Well, when we look at the issue of gun violence, we know that it's been over 25 years since the US has passed any major gun legislation, and that is reflected in the way gun violence manifests in the US. Um, the two biggest issues that, or the two biggest solutions that Everytown and Students Demand Action are really pushing for on the federal level are background checks on every gun sale and red flag laws. The research shows that these two laws can really make a big impact on gun violence in this nation by closing loopholes that people use to gain access to guns when they shouldn't, with the background checks, and making sure that people who shouldn't have access to guns aren't accessing them when they are at risk of hurting themselves or others with those red flag laws.
What is your concern with regard to guns and schools? Because, of course, mass shootings at schools decreased because everyone was on a remote virtual learning setting. Now we're seeing this rise in mass shootings. Are you concerned that those mass shootings we saw a couple years back and even a year back are going to start rising again and more of these incidents are going to become common?
Yes, obviously. We see that as we return to normal life, the constant stream of mass shootings is returning with it. And along with that is going to be those school shootings. And as a nation, when we think about the word school shooting, it's horrendous to think about that this is a place where kids come to learn. It's a place where a lot of kids feel safe, and sometimes it's the only place that they can feel safe. And the fact that we are experiencing such a high number of shootings taking place in schools is so difficult for us to approach as a nation. But we also have to recognize that this is not a problem without solutions, and it is preventable. We know that 90% of mass shooters in schools exhibit signs ahead of the shooting that they are at risk of hurting others. And so we can use that knowledge to look at the solutions and pass things like red flag laws to try to prevent these tragedies from happening in the future.
Do you believe that elected officials have passed enough legislation to the point where guns are regulated enough to the point where people can still have them, but mass shootings not become the biggest concern when guns are available to people?
Well, at this current time, we haven't passed enough laws. Our current system around guns makes it too easy for people who shouldn't have guns to gain access to them. And it is the responsibility of our elected officials to pass the laws that we're pushing for, that the majority of Americans want and that our country really needs. And when it comes to the issue of restricting people's rights to have guns and so on, people have a right to own guns. It's evident in our Constitution. The Second Amendment states that. But that does not include people who have the intention of using those guns to hurt themselves or others. So when it comes to us putting in place laws to make sure that those people who shouldn't have the guns aren't getting them, it's not restricting the right of lawful citizens from obtaining guns. It doesn't cause any inconvenience to someone who wants to buy a gun if they have to go through a background check, unless they're not going to pass that background check. So it doesn't really restrict people, and that form of rhetoric that says that is only scaring people away from supporting these life-saving laws.
What do you think is the best way to get those on the conservative side of the aisle on board with these proposed changes? And do you believe there is a point where conservatives and Democrats can come together on meaningful legislation to prevent these incidents?
Well, when we look at legislation on the federal level, we know we have uh, m almost every Democrat in the Senate and the House supporting this legislation, and we have strong allies on the Republican side of the aisle. With that being said, the vast majority of Americans want these laws that we want to be passed. 93% of Americans, including 89% of Republicans and 89% of gun owners, support background checks. And trying to prove to Republicans that this is something that Americans want is definitely the approach that we need to be taking. And we need to make sure that Americans are voicing their support for those laws. And at the same time, at this time, the NRA is sidelined. They have so many inner conflicts going on that they can't stop us from passing this legislation. And us as Students Demand Action and Everytown for Gun Safety, we're not going to stop fighting for this, and we are going to work until they get passed.
Is there anything else you want people to know about this, your cause and activism for gun control and reform? And for those who are concerned that you mean to take away their guns, what is your response?
That's not any of our intentions. If you are legally allowed to have a gun and you don't have the intention of hurting others, you should be able to have a gun. That's simple. But when it comes to people who are at risk of suicide or at risk of harming someone else, I think everyone can agree that those people should not be owning guns. And I would say that if you aren't one of those people and you're not thinking of hurting yourself and you're not thinking of hurting others, then you shouldn't be worried that we want to take your guns, because you will be able to have a safe gun in your home if you want it. And in terms of what I'd want people to know, I think it's important to recognize that even though so many people are inspired to join this movement because of the headlines of mass shootings, even with the tremendous amount of mass shootings we see in the US, those only account for less than 1% of gun deaths in the US. The rest of those are mostly gun suicides and homicides, and that needs to be reflected in our national conversations, because they aren't as interesting to news sources, so they're not covered as much. But they are essential to the legislation that we want to pass, because those deaths are really important, and those lives we want to do as much as we can to prevent losing those lives. Yeah.
Zach, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Jaden, for the interview.